let's get right into part 2. In the first part, we looked at the French with e4, e6. Now we're going to look at the rest of the repertoire for d4, c4, and knight f3 using what has been dubbed by Grandmaster of Rook, Sarin's Queen's Gambit. So how we get there is with our first two characteristic moves, e6, d5. And normally we're going to see move 3, knight c3, but knight f3 is played very often as well. And here I did get questions by beta testers, well, why didn't you revisit, say, the Janowski variation with a6? Because you wrote the aggressive Queen's Gambit decline, which focused on this move. Simply put, I don't think it's a great move for beginners. There's a decent amount of theory, and this course is more targeted for beginner and intermediate players. I wanted something more concise, manageable, that you can build upon very easily. And, well, what about the traditional Queen's Gambit? Well, honestly, it's the same answer, because the traditional Queen's Gambit is a deeply involved opening, to say the least, as well as the main line of the Catalan. And we're going to see in this video how there's a handful of memory markers that we can use to just generally play our positions with 3h6. So what's the significance of this move? Because it goes against opening principles. Well, why not just, say, develop our knight to f6? Well, in the main course, I do spend the introduction going over a number of different options that white has. But I would say the exchange variation here, with the plan of e3, bishop d3, knight e2, with the eventual plan to break in the center, this is one of the best scoring lines in d4 for white. And when you look at the career history of Kasparov in this position, he did not lose one game in his entire career playing other world elite players in this position, and played quite a number of games. And I show off one of the Kasparov games against Ulf Andersson in the introduction. Stay away from these, and what we're going to see in the next line is how to meet this plan in the exchange variation, and why our move order with h6 actually leaves us far more flexible. So coming back from the beginning, we've got our e6, d5 structure, h6 on move 3, always taking away bishop g5, now knight c3, knight f6, and we've got the topical position where the pawn on d5 can be captured at any point in time transposing, but we're either going to have the passive but solid e3 or bishop f4. So if bishop f4, we have the dynamic of if they capture, which we're about to go over those lines first, or if they drop back to keep tension with bishop g3, or immediately capture on d6. So overall, not that many branches, much like with the French. So let's start with if they capture. One of the significant features is with the e-pawn removed, we have the ability to get what's typically our bad bishop out into the game and active. So after bishop f4, one of the memory markers that we're going to see across these variations is anytime the bishop comes to f4, we immediately challenge the bishop. After takes, e3, and now it's a good place to castle, and no matter what white does here, we have a great square for our bishop, and we've got fighting equality without any issues. For instance, if h3, bishop at f5, and if bishop d3, we've got bishop g4, where we have no problem getting rid of our bad bishop for that knight, and we're generally very solid here with, say, that type of structure and a5 to play against the minority attack plan. So next up, we've got one innovation that I had in the text and a novelty deviating from many games by strong grandmasters. So after bishop f4, we need to optimize development. And one thing you need to be careful about here is seeing we need to get our bad bishop out. when we have the opportunity. If you rush it with bishop f5, you can find yourself in a bad situation immediately with too much pressure in the position. So it's much better after bishop f4 to solidify first, and then on the subsequent move, get the bishop out. And again, we see a line, when the e-pawn is removed, the bishop's able to come out. Challenge the bishop again. And bishop takes d6 gives black no trouble equalizing. Take with the queen, put the knights on e7 and d7. And here with knight ge2, following the idea of the aforementioned Kasparov variation of the exchange with f3, e4, what's different is we do not have the knight on f6, and we're not going to be tempoed by the pawn. So a key move and novelty here is knight e7. Because after castle, castle, f3, white's still playing for that standard break. And as a note, if rook b1, a5, we're directly playing against the minority attack plan. So f3, takes, queen b6, where it gets difficult for white to play their thematic break. Next up, let's take a look at the keep tension bishop g3 main line. So after bishop f4, bishop d6. And in the French, we often focus on don't trade off the good bishop, trade off the bad bishop. So why are we making such a drastic change here? Well, we get development and time in the event that they capture. So it's trading advantages to a certain extent. And unlike the French, we have a much easier time getting our bad bishop into the game, as the pawn structure in the center is not completely locked. So we've got more flexibility. And across all the lines, we see black develop all pieces without issue. So here after bishop d6, bishop g3, and I'm not in a hurry to immediately capture, because once white's drop back, if they do decide to capture, we're still just gaining time with the recapture, and they've wasted a full extra move. And in a lot of variations, I'm going to wait until white has distracted some of the pieces so that when I capture on g3, they're not going to be able to utilize the open h-file for the rook. So after castling is a good note, or say instead of the bishop being on d3, it's on c4, where it doesn't exert as much pressure as it would on the b1 h7 diagonal. So after this, castles, e3, and there's a lot of flexibility when looking at the database, and I decided to keep with thematic play across these lines and try to avoid isolated pawns whenever possible. In this case, capturing immediately gets the bishop to c4 where we want the bishop, just biting on granite here. Now I capture, and I get the thematic break in with c5. There's just no easy way for white to attack, and say if they capture after queen a5, you can't hold on to the c5 pawn, and we can very easily get our bishop out, followed by the knight with good play. So next up, what if they take immediately? We've got a few of these lines. So after bishop f4, bishop d6, so say if takes, well, queen takes. And after e3, castles. And we will look at c5 in a future variation, but rook c1 keeps tension. So now it's a question of what is the best way to get our pieces into the game. Unlike the previous line, I kind of worry about when to play c5. So first, a6. And it's a flexible move. It's taking away white's use of the b5 square, as well as when we capture, we may very well have the potential to play b5 ourselves, gaining time and giving a square for our bishop on b7. So a3, and this is the most popular move, creating a retreat square for the bishop in the event that we capture. The bishop's looking to come around, with backing up from the queen to play for the h7 square. But we're not too worried about it, as we're able to play for this theme with c5, not b5. Because in the event that they capture, with the bishop on c4, there's no discoveries on the queen, which again gives the same themes as the previous variation for easy development for black to just get into the game and get with the fight. So next up, we have the same theme with capture, and after e3, back to a6. So what if they ever play c5? The queen's going to go on the same square every time on e7, and generally a theme with queen pawn games is if the pawn goes to c5, we want to break in the center to undermine the chain. So after bishop e2, c6, followed by e5, and notice as the central tension resolves, our bishop's going to be able to get out without issue. So time and again, we're seeing that our worst piece, our c8 bishop, has no issues in the Sarin Queen's Gambit. So now what about the solid e3? Not exactly a line we have to worry too much about. Well, I like flexibility. So knight b to d7, and after bishop d3, we have the ability to go ahead and capture, getting the stutter step and looking to get tempo if possible. So a4 to stop us. So we do the next best thing, go back to our standard plan with c5. And these are themes that you'll also see in the Queen's Gambit accepted. And here, the main theme that you need to take into account is white is going to play e4 and have this menacing center and wants to get the bishop out. So playing against the center is the core theme of this variation. So first bishop d6, and we waited as long as we could to make this move because they're immediately going to capture and tempo our bishop. We don't want to capture ourselves because white's able to just get the bishop out without issues. So keeping tension gives more practical problems for the opponent. After takes, e4. Now, this will occur in a lot of openings. I'll see it often, say, for instance, in the Alpen Sicilian. If white's able to get a pawn on e5 and then follow up with knight e4, there's a lot of square control and it can be a big problem for us. So we cannot allow e5. But playing e5 ourselves is also going to leave issues on the d5 square. So we need to use a tempo to maintain control. And white will never be able to accomplish e5 due to all of our pieces coordinated as such. So next up, we've got my favorite variation of the course. Is I wanted something new, and I do believe that I'm the first author to publish on this particular rare variation of the Catalan. And there's only a handful of games in the database so far, and a lot of them are by very strong grandmasters like Zhang. So what is it and what are we recommending? Well, back to h6 and g3. So I began to study these lines and I was reminded initially of preparation from way back in the Grandmaster Repertoire series text, where Grandmaster of Rook shows how in this position, if black is one of those universal players trying to play a Slav, they can get into a lot of trouble here. And I do have a few games on the channel where I played this with white, where you go knight d2, followed by e4, and the ill placement of the bishop you end up losing time no matter what, and you've lost the center. So this move with c6 is quite terrible. And right here is generally the memory marker of how to play this position. If knight c3, white will not be able to exert pressure on e5 with a bishop on b2. They've committed tonight to c3. We're going to be able to play knight c6 and play for an e5 break. If white does any other move, say queen c2, we're going to go for b6. So why can't it be universal? Why can't I play b6 here? Well, it's back to this plan with knight d2. So little memory markers there. Knight c3 is met by knight c6. Any other move by white, any other reasonable move we'll say, is met by b6. So after knight c6, b3, we're going to take and immediately solve the problem of our bad bishop on c8. Let's do another Catalan line. And this time we're going to start from the ready move order with knight f3. And keep in mind, it does work. You just start with e6, d5. You're going to be getting our positions no matter what. And say, for instance, d4 gets back to our Catalan lines. And if b3, we're going to get colors reverse Boni, which we're going to be following up with in this variation. I wanted to give some aggressive spice, and you have to be careful for what we recommend to play against the King's Indian attack. So let's say I use this move order. Well, white, by holding back on the d-pawn, is trying to get us to show what we want to play. So h6 is going to be the best move. I'm able to make this work effectively against both the Catalan and King's Indian attack. So if they go d4, well, we are right back in our lines. So after d5, g3, if white opts to not play d4, say they go b3, there's a bit of a fancy move here that I really liked, d4, where we are forcing a Boni structure, and the pawn isn't exactly free due to bishop e5 here. And e5, again, we're able to fix the problem of our bishop. And the engine deems this position about equal, because white has a lot of room for future coordination with the minor pieces, but I feel like black's position is very easy to play. So coming back to this key position, b3, we've got d4, followed by bishop b2. Shut down that bishop and support the pawn. That's the main themes. And generally with the Boni, what you need to take into account, as I'll rush forward a little bit here, is you play a move like h6, so that when the bishop comes to f5, it can drop back. But with this bishop on f5, we're hitting the Boni pawn, and then we're looking to place a knight to hit again that Boni pawn. The other capture is definitely possible as well, where you'll see this same kind of theme, and I'll just make a few moves here. So say bishop f5 to hit the pawn, and then we're looking for that type of maneuver, knight d7 to c5, where both the pieces. And I've had this position colors reversed on the channel as well. So now back to Catalan, more pure move order. So b3 gets to our Boni positions. If d3, c5, where we'll look to shut down the position. And if d4, h6, preventing the bishop g5 stuff. So again, memory markers. If knight c3, knight c6, and if queen c2, b6. And when initially analyzing these positions, I was a bit confused because I'm like, okay, it's an open position. Don't give up the bishop pair. How is the engine still evaluating this equal? Well, after the capture, these doubled central pawns And you see also in the Philidor opening, there's a line where we get doubled e-pawns. It's the same sort of theme that we have control over a good number of key squares that white would typically be using. We have no issues here completing development and even have some aggressive ideas with rerouting pieces. So knight c6 to e7, bishop c8 to f5. It's slow, it's steady, but currently in the database, there has only been 4 master level games with black scoring 3 out of 4. So it's got surprise value, bit difficult to play for white, but we can slowly improve. Exactly what you're looking for in the starting repertoire. Can't ask for much more than that. So we've made it through the major stuff, the Queen's Gambit and Catalan, which you'll face, I would say, easily 6 to 7 out of 10 of your games when you play against e4. Well, what about some of these popular sidelines, like the London system? Well, I tried to keep it where we have easy thematic overlap in ideas. And we'll look at the Jobava London in the next line. So say e3, we're back to our Sarin Queen's Gambit theme of challenging the bishop. And after knight d2, we're going to be following a line that Grandmaster Michael Adams played, and I offered something similar in the aggressive Queen's Gambit decline as an alternative variation, but we went into more detail in this course. So first is the move order here. If you go c5 immediately, when they capture, it deflects the bishop and we have to waste time. So I like b6 as we're waiting for white to choose where their pieces are going to go. So knight gf3, bishop b7. And now knight e5. White's looking to play f4 and eventually go for an all-out kingside attack. We've got our basic development. Okay, now c5, that is supported by the b-pawn. And this next move is critical for the evaluation of the position. Where do we place the knight? If you place the knight on the wrong square, you're looking to lose. Knight c6. We need to keep an eye on our bishop, and as we'll see, this knight is going to be making a very necessary journey to play against this kingside attack idea that white has, and it completely neuters white's position. So after f4, knight e7. So the importance of that knight is already seen. Knight f5. So white's looking to play g4 to kick our knight. We're again focused on shutting down the eye of this bishop. We drop our bishop back, which gives our knight a square. So after knight d6, knight fe4. And when you check the database in this position, black's been doing quite well, and the engine doesn't think much about white's overextension here. Dynamically balanced position with room to fight. All right, so what about the Jobava London? Well, this is going to come directly from a Hans Niemann game back to Bishop d6, who authored a course on Chessable on the Jobava London. So needless to say, when you can go to war with an author in their own line and get reasonable positions, probably a good idea. So after e3, and Magnus also played this position. So it's easy to play a move like queen d6 here to try to get tempo, but I want to leave the f4 pawn as bait. White's got a really good grip on the e5 square. I mean, ideally they'd like to get back to that plan that we saw in the London system in the previous variation to go for an attack. So we need to play against this plan. What's our worst piece? c8 bishop. b6 gives us some ideas that maybe bishop a6 is a good idea in the future. And after knight f3, this knight could be useful on e5. Knight e7. We've got the ability to play f6 in the future. Again, all of these moves are staying flexible. So what about h4? And this is a good prophylactic move to be able to kick the knight in the event that it goes to g6. So c5 with our themes coming back from the French. And after h5. h6 was played in the main game, and I feel like this is a bit more accurate, as allowing the pawn going to h6 really isn't a big deal here, but if you play h6, then it's going to encourage white to go rook h3, rook g3 at some point to attack the structure. For instance, we're far more solid here, and after knight f5, we're back to those French defense themes that are often thematic. All right, so what about the Tory? Well, it's a bit different that it's not a pure Tory with knight f6. We have the ability to go bishop e7 and gain time with the immediate threat on the b-pawn. And we're going to fix the problem of our bad bishop without too much hesitation here. If white allows us to play e5, we should definitely do it. And we've already gotten full equality in the position. So Nimzo-Larsen, and of course, the direct Nimzo-Larsen's with b3. But we want to make it work against everything, so we get a bit of a transposition here. And we're going to do a copycat variation with b6, followed by bishop b7. And this is the critical moment, because once c4 is played, I do not want to play c5, as it gives white the opportunity to choose what structure they want. So here, I choose the structure. I don't want an isolated pawn, and I'm going to play c5. Very, very clean, straightforward development, equal position to fight from. So now we've got Colle system, and very often you're going to find that the move 5 e3 variation we're going to get, and we've saved on h6. So after bishop d3, c5, we've got a standard solid position. So why, for instance, in the London system, did we place the knight on c6 versus in the Colle system, we're placing it on d7? In the London, we needed that maneuver to shut down the bishop. Here, we need our bishop to keep an eye on e4. Why is this so important? Colle system players dream of their e4 break, where they've wasted a tempo going from e3 to e4 to just simplify the position and trade everything off. I would say most of the time it's playing for a draw with white. I see this when I'm playing against a much lower rated player who's just doing anything they can to trade pieces in order not to get hurt. That's like running from your opponent in boxing. So keeping the tension in this way prevents them from the natural play. So after queen e2, instead of bishop e7, knight e4 is definitely a possibility, but I gave that as an alternative line. You can allow them to complete their plan, and we get a position that's very, very similar to the Rubinstein French, where white has wasted a full tempo, and if we compare, black's already fully developed, whereas white still has the bishop on c1, and I would say the tension is more favorable for us in the center. So last but certainly not least, we've got dealing with the bird. And one great thing is with the bird, it's a colors reversed Dutch, and we can generally get the same structure to play universally. So against the Leningrad, what we're looking to do is place the bishop on d6, followed by f6, knight ge7. Against the classical Dutch, we'll put the bishop on d6, put the knight on e7, followed by f6. And against the Stonewall, you got it. It is the same plan again to prevent the knight from using the e5 square. And we can easily go queen c7, bishop d7, and decide where we want to castle, and we're even looking at the potential of an e5 break. So that's going to be a short and sweet overview of the lines covered in the second half of the 1e6 versus everything course. In the next video in the series, I'm going to show you how you can use a lot of these ideas to have a white repertoire. So you can even see already with the bird being a colors reverse Dutch, we can get these exact same positions with the same plans with an extra move. So it's important to understand structural overlap. So hopefully this series is helping you out and showing you how to play opening repertoire for